Hi everyone, so I'm Dr. Erin Pritchard, and I'm going to talk about my chapter, which is chapter 7 in the Cultural Stations of Disabilities book, the new book by David Bolt. So my chapter focuses on dwarfism, and it's entitled From Little Helpers to Burney Nesbitt. Now, I did originally want to call it From Little Helpers to Wee Little Shits, because that is what Burney Nesbitt is. But he's the most realistic representation of dwarfism that I have seen so far, or one of the most realistic until Peter Dinklage came along. So in this chapter, I focus on two very distinctive cultural stations of dwarfism that I am very familiar with, and that most of you will be familiar with the first one, which is the Little Helpers. So Little Helpers can range from anything like Santa's little elves, to Oompa Loompas, to the Munchkins, to even like the Minions, who are not dwarfs and never played by dwarfs, luckily. We've had no dwarf dwarf actors or performers moaning that they can't play a Minion, because all of these are certain helpers that play on the meta-narrative of dwarfism. And so if you're familiar with that, the meta-narrative of dwarfism is that dwarfs are always seen, or mostly seen, as very childlike. So they're infantilized a lot. They're always in a race. There's always a race of them, isn't there? Like when you think of Snow White, 7 dwarfs, you think of Munchkins or Lumpers, there's always a group of us, which is very weird because we don't live as a race of separate people, if you can call us that, okay? Most people with dwarfism are born to average sized parents. So 80% of us, so like myself, I have an average sized family. But people always think that we do live like together in our own little community. You know, Warwick Davis sort of influenced this in Willow, you know, when he lived with the Nelwyns. But the truth is, we don't. We live just amongst society, which seems to shock a lot of people. Okay, but if you think that we live in a separate race, then would you apply that to, say, autistic people or people who use wheelchairs? No. But this is this result of these little beings, because one dwarf is fascinating. A bunch of them is just amazing, and it makes for this amusing story where there's like this group of Oompa living together. But really, these helpers are subordinate because they're always helpers. They're never the protagonist. They're never the hero. They're never the controller, the manager. So you've got Santa, who is this big fat man that lives in the North Pole, and working for him are the elves, these little tiny creatures. Now, of course, people say, but they're elves, not dwarves. The problem is they link onto a lot of the meta-narrative of dwarfism. They are childlike, and they're often funny, and they're subordinate. Again, that's the same with the Oompa Loompas. They have this freak show sort of grasp that people want to see them because, oh my god, dwarfs, and look, oh my god, Oompa Loompas. Because the first thing in Willy Wonka, when the Oompa Loompas come on, I think, is it Charlie points at them and Veruca Salt shouts at them, oh look, over there, there's little men. It is that reaction that they are a novelty. So that's always been the case, and it's like the reason why in these children's films or stories like Santa's elves and all that they're little creatures, is because it challenges that capitalist notion that, oh look, we've got a load of workers here and they are our slaves. Okay, it makes it funny, it makes it acceptable because there's this whimsical nature about them. And if you look at the Minions, who I didn't mind in the first Despicable Me, but then hated afterwards because the producers or the creators realised, oh look, people find them funny, they laugh at them, so let's really milk that for all it's worth, and it just becomes boring. Okay, but they all work for group. They don't talk, very much like the Oompa Loompas who do these weird singing. But those are all lip synced, by the way, because there's no dialogue for them. And it's the same with the Minions who speak like this Minionese. Okay, they have their own separate language, reinforcing that they're a separate race. So that's that. Now, the second cultural station that I focus on is so different. If anybody grew up in the 80s watching comedies, British comedies, then you've probably seen Rab C. Nesbitt. Rab C Nesbitt is a caricature of sort of the Scottish working class, and it was created by Scottish producers, Scottish writers, and had Scottish actors in it. Now, I grew up on a council estate in North Wales, so I'm very working class background, and of course, I've you know encountered that working class abuse kind of thing where you look down upon. So even when I was in university at Bangor, when people would say, "Oh, let's not be racist, let's not be homophobic, we're all great and all wonderful and left wing," which I am, but then they would insult the local council estate and the people from it, going, "Well, at least I'm not like them." And I thought, well, I am. But anyway, so what Burney Nesbitt is, he is part of a family. So Rab C Nesbitt is the main person. He is this man who's a drunk and working class and doesn't work. And he's got his wife, Mary, and his son, Gash, who's average stature. They're all average stature except Burney Nesbitt. Burney Nesbitt is a dwarf. And it was the only time I ever saw someone with dwarfism in an everyday family when I was growing up. I never saw them anywhere else. I saw Snow White and her little helpers. And as a child, I didn't mind that film because I knew it was fiction. The people who didn't seem to know it was fiction were middle-aged men. But that's another story. So I got abuse as a result of those little helpers. I got asked where Snow White was. I got asked if I was grumpy or happy. I got the Oompa Loompa song sung at me. I never ever had any quotes from Burney Nesbitt shouted at me because they were never there to abuse me. So in Rab C Nesbitt, which is a comedy, none of the comedy is aimed at Burney, or Burney's dwarfism, I should say. He is a target of comedy. He's a target of humour, just like Rab is, just like Mary is. But the target of the humour is towards him being working class and Scottish, not towards him being a dwarf. So what it demonstrates is you can have an actor with dwarfism, and this is a big. There's a difference between being an actor with dwarfism, who plays an everyday role, like Peter Dinklage, or Eric Cullen, who plays Burney Nesbitt, than being a dwarf actor who has to rely on very stereotypical roles like the Seven Dwarfs, aka Warwick Davis. Okay, so what Eric Cullen does as Burney Nesbitt, he shows, look, I am in a council estate, I'm from an average sized family, and yes, I'm like everyone else. I can give abuse that is humorous towards the other characters, and I can take it. So the humour is never towards his size. He's always called, he's sometimes called wee Burney Nesbitt, but wee is this, Scottish term that is used towards most people. Even if you're youngest in the family, you're called the wee one, It's just that's normalised. So to me, Burney presented something that, people didn't recognise until 30 years later when Peter Dinklage was in, or 20 or 30 years later when Peter Dinklage was in Game of Thrones. What I argue in this was it was happening way before. And this cultural station using autocritical discourse analysis, I'm presenting it as something that's really, ahead of its time. And there is this criticism against Rab C Nesbitt now where the creator says, oh, we won't be able to do it now because, of all these woke attitudes. But what I'm arguing is Rab C Nesbitt is actually a very woke comedy. It highlights a lot of, those working class divisions and the discrimination because, like most Scottish people at that time, it's very anti-Thatcher. Okay, and that's what working class should be because of how she destroyed the working class. And so it's very woke, and it's one of the most woke comedies that I know of, even though, there might be other criticisms towards the way it represents working class people. But it's saying it's, Rab insults a lot of the Thatcherites, he insults a lot of the upper class, middle class families. And Burney Nesbitt does that too, and he does it through his dwarfism. But again, there is only one scene which I draw on, one episode, sorry, not scene, where Burney enrolls in this art college. He's a very talented artist, it turns out. And of course, education and all this wasn't sort of, it was never envisaged that either of Rab's sons would go to university. So when Burney gets enrolled in this posh art college, that's seen as more of a stigma upon him than his dwarfism. Okay, he's referred to as a freak or a geek because he's enrolled in that. This is one problem I had was the Scottish accent, I couldn't really decipher a lot of it, so it was really difficult if I've got some of it wrong. But he goes to this art college, and when he enters, his mother, trying to be good, puts him in like an old-fashioned school uniform because she has no idea of how these education establishments work, because working class people do not go to them at this point. So he turns up in this really awful sort of, Just William kind of school uniform. And when they turn around and see him enter, all the other students and there's the headmaster look at him with shock. And the headmaster, the teacher, sorry, goes, oh, who's asked for the bellboy? Or who's rung for the bellboy? To which all the students laugh. Now, this deflects from him entering as a person with dwarfism, which might have got him wanted attention. Instead, it positions him and the embarrassment of the way he is dressed. So there's no laughter towards his dwarfism. It's at this mistake that's been made because people from working class background he's going to an art college. I've never been here. My parents don't prep me for Oxford. My family don't buy me a place in higher education. So this is all new and arcane to me. And I found that very interesting. So overall, these cultural stations, one of them is kind of inherently negative. And no, I'm not asking for them to be banned or anything, but to be questioned and critiqued. And the second is a very positive representation, because I think often in disability studies, and I see this a lot with my students, representations have to be negative, and we always have to look for the negative in these representations. Whereas actually Burney Nesbitt is a very, very positive representation because it normalizes dwarfism. But the problem is, what it highlights is if we're celebrating this one representation, wow, I saw dwarfism as normal, then it predominantly demonstrates how dwarfism is still inherently portrayed as something that's very different. You have to play on the dwarfism. You can't just have a character there who is just a person with dwarfism, but are very complex, and we focus on their other identities, which are more important to the plot of the film or the television show. So thank you for listening to that ramble. Just stop this now.